The Galactic Council had 47 member species, and not one of them paid much attention to the humans. That was their first mistake. It would not be their last. The council chamber on Convergence Point Station was a wide circular room with 47 seats arranged in gentle tiers around a central holographic display. The display could show any point in the known galaxy at the touch of a button. It smelled like recycled air and old arguments. That was appropriate because it had been recycling both for about 800 years. Councillor Drevik of the Third Confederacy sat in the second tier and watched the monthly status reports cycle through. Trade corridors, border updates, stellar event warnings. The usual business of a galaxy that contained far too many civilizations with far too many opinions and never quite enough patience. When the display reached the Sol system, he barely glanced at it. The human file was not impressive. One habitable planet. A population of 12 billion, 300 years of space travel, most of it spent crawling around their own solar system. A military of 12 warships, all of them small, all of them slow, all of them armed with weapons that would have embarrassed a Thari defense garrison from 2 centuries ago. Drevik had read the file once. He had not updated it in 3 years. There had been no reason to. The humans had joined the council 6 years ago. They arrived with a single diplomatic cruiser and an ambassador named Lin Chen, who smiled at everyone and laughed too loudly at things that were only mildly funny. They brought gift baskets containing something called coffee. 7 species had bad reactions to it. The humans apologized and brought tea instead, which affected only 4 species. They considered this an improvement and seemed genuinely proud of the progress. They showed up to every council session, not just the sessions that concerned them. Every session. They sat in the back row. They took notes. Ambassador Chen had a small physical notepad made of actual paper, which most species found charmingly primitive and a few found deeply strange. She wrote in it constantly. She listened to everything. Drevik had once watched her sit through a 6-hour border dispute between the Keth and the Morali, a dispute that had nothing to do with humans and which would not affect humanity in any way. And she had taken notes the entire time. When it was over, she thanked both sides for an illuminating discussion and smiled at everyone on her way out. He had found it endearing in the way that small harmless things are endearing. He closed the human file. 9 billion kilometers from Convergence Point Station, past Jupiter, past Saturn, past the thin, cold scatter of the outer system's debris fields, in a region where the sun was just another bright star in a sky full of them. Cale Marsh was crawling through a maintenance corridor the size of a highway tunnel. He was 26. He had grown up in Edmonton, Canada, which was cold and flat and had a hockey team that reliably broke its fans' hearts. He had studied aerospace engineering, finished in the top 10% of his class, and applied to the Unified Human Infrastructure Corps on a combination of ambition and the vague feeling that something important was happening and he wanted to be part of it. He had signed more legal documents than he had previously signed in his entire life. He had not read all of them as carefully as he should have. He sometimes thought about this. He had been working on the ship for 2 years. He reached the access panel at the end of the corridor, a panel the size of a garage door, and opened it to find the 3 power couplings that needed replacing. Above the panel, a viewport 30 centimeters across looked out at the exterior. He tried not to look at the exterior for too long. The hull curved away from him in every direction, not like a normal ship, where you could see the nose or the tail from most positions on the hull. This curved the way a planet curves. It went left and became a distant plane of dark metal. It went right and became a horizon too far away to make sense of. Below the viewport, the hull dropped into distance. Above, more hull, climbing until it too disappeared into the dark. He had walked this same corridor for 2 years and never found the end of it. The ship was called UHS Colossus. It was 9,200 kilometers across. Its surface area was approximately equal to Asia and Europe combined, on each side, all the way around a sphere. Its primary weapons arrays, when fired at full power, could crack the crust of a rocky planet in 4 hours. Its armor plating was 3 kilometers thick at the thinnest points. At the structural reinforcement zones, 9 kilometers. It was one of 7. Humanity had been building them for 31 years. The decision had come from a team of intelligence analysts who were asked to look at something very specific: the patterns of movement in the deep outer galaxy, past the mapped regions, out in the dark where the sensors barely reached, and tell the serious people what was there. The analysts had looked. They had looked very carefully and for a very long time. What they found was a pattern. Something moving. Something that had been moving for a very long time. Passing through civilizations the way a slow fire passes through dry forest. Unhurried, thorough, and leaving nothing. 14 civilizations confirmed gone, their ruins cold and stripped, no bodies, no survivors, no signals, just the shape of what had once been alive and wasn't anymore. The serious people who received the report went quiet for a long time. Then they started building. The construction was hidden by making it look like many small unrelated things in a place that nobody was watching. Each component was labeled as infrastructure, relay stations, processing platforms, long-range antenna arrays. The pieces were assembled over years in the cold dark of the outer solar system, hidden behind light-bending masking fields developed specifically for this program, using technology that didn't officially exist yet. 31 years, 7 ships. The Galactic Council had not been told, not because humanity distrusted the Council exactly, but because the Council contained 46 species besides humanity, and each of those species had their own governments, their own intelligence services, their own leaks. If the Council knew, the thing in the dark would eventually know, and the thing in the dark could not know. Not yet. Not until the ships were ready. Kale replaced the first coupling, then the second. He thought about his sister's kids back in Edmonton. He thought about how long it had been since he'd seen them. He thought about the coffee in the crew bay on level 400, which was much better than the coffee on level 942. And he had spent 2 years failing to understand why. He replaced the third coupling, sealed the panel, ran the diagnostic. His comm clicked. Marsh. Status on the couplings done. Running clean. What's this about the drive test being moved up? A pause. Shift supervisors on the Colossus were chosen partly for their ability to deliver information in a tone that conveyed weight without causing panic. It's moved up significantly. Get some sleep. You'll want to be rested. Kale understood. He gathered his tools and floated toward the transit shaft. He found his bunk room, 4 bunks, 1 viewport, the smell of recycled air, and lay down without removing his boots. He stared at the ceiling. The ceiling was part of a ship, 9,000 kilometers across. He thought about the projections he had seen in a briefing 14 months ago, the ones about where the Vord were and where they were going and how fast and what would be left when they arrived. He thought about the timeline. He thought about how the timeline had just moved up significantly. Outside his viewport, the star that was his sun was a bright point at an enormous distance. The 7 ships sat in the dark around him, invisible, silent, waiting. No one in the galaxy knew they were there. No one outside this program anyway. He closed his eyes. The Thari scout ship Veneth's Eye was on a standard survey run 300 light-years from home when Lieutenant Sarek detected the anomaly. It was a sensor ghost, a return that matched nothing in the combined navigation database. Not a stellar body, not a debris field, not any cataloged phenomenon. It sat at the very outer edge of the human solar system, in a region the human charts marked with the notation: Restricted Infrastructure Zone, Human Sovereign Space, Non-Entry Requested. Sarek noted the restriction. He noted that request was different from prohibited. He noted that investigating anomalies was his explicit job. He brought the Veneth's Eye out of FTL travel. The bridge was quiet for several seconds. His co-pilot Ven said something in Thari that translated roughly to, "My instruments are telling me something I do not want to know." "Run a diagnostic," Sarek said. The diagnostic came back clean. The instruments were working perfectly. The sensors said there were 7 objects ahead, each one approximately 9,000 kilometers across. Dense, artificial construction. Surface temperatures too stable for any natural body. Power readings, enormous, contained, structured, matching nothing in the database. He switched to long-range optical. The images took 15 seconds to render. 7 shapes, dark gray, almost black, nearly perfect spheres. Each one so large that at his current range, the range at which he usually surveyed small planets, he could not see the complete shape of any single one. He could see sections. Vast hull sections dotted with structures rising 60 kilometers from the surface. And across those hull sections, at intervals so precise they could only be designed, circular openings. His instruments identified them as weapons ports. There were thousands of them. He zoomed out to maximum optical range. All 7 shapes became visible at once. They sat in a loose formation in the dark, wrapped in fields that had been bending light around them, swallowing every passive sensor return for. He ran the calculation: at least 20 years. 20 years. These had been sitting here for 20 years and no one had found them. Sarek's hands were still. He had made them still by effort of will. All communications off, he said. Passive mode only. No pings, no beacon contact. He looked at his navigation officer. Calculated jump, non-standard corridor. Sir, now. He did not look away from the optical feed. The 7 shapes sat in the dark without moving. No weapons tracked the Veneth's Eye. No signals were sent. They were simply there, as they had been there for 20 years. patient and dark and vast. He thought about the human military assessment report. 12 warships. He thought about Ambassador Chen's notepad. He thought about humans sitting in the back row at every council session, listening, learning, taking notes. Jump ready, the navigation officer said. Jump. The Veneth's eye vanished. The 7 ships stayed behind, motionless, silent, waiting for the thing that was coming as they had waited for 31 years. Part 2. Councillor Drevik had been in politics for 40 years. He had survived 3 regime changes, 2 border wars, and a trade dispute so complex it required its own dedicated arbitration station. He had not, in that entire time, been genuinely surprised by anything in a council session. He was surprised now. Lieutenant Sarek stood at the center of the chamber and delivered his report in a flat, careful voice that suggested he had rehearsed it many times to make sure the words came out in the right order. The holographic display behind him showed the optical imaging from the Veneth's eye. 7 shapes, 9,000 kilometers each, thousands of weapons ports, power readings that made the chamber's own systems look like children's toys. The chamber was absolutely silent when he fished. Then everyone started talking at once. Drevik did not talk. He looked at the imaging. He looked at the mass readings and the power readings and the weapons port count. And he sat very still, doing what politicians do when they realize they have fundamentally misunderstood a situation. Recalculating. 12 warships. He had believed the assessment for 3 years without once questioning it. He had watched humans sit in the back row and take notes and smile too wide and thought, harmless, young, small. He looked at the images, 9,000 kilometers, summoned the human ambassador, he said. His voice cut through the noise. The chamber quieted. Today, Ambassador Lin Chen arrived at Convergence Point Station 14 hours after the summons was sent. She arrived alone aboard the same modest diplomatic cruiser humanity always used. In the same practical gray suit she wore to most sessions, she had her notepad. She walked into the full council chamber, every seat occupied, which only happened during crises, and she smiled at everyone. Drevik had watched humans smile 1,000 times. He had always read it as warmth, friendliness, openness. Now, watching Chen walk calmly to the center of the chamber, with 7 images of 9,000-kilometer warships displayed on the holographic behind her, he understood for the first time that a smile could mean something else entirely. It could mean, I have been ready for this conversation for years. Ambassador Chen, Drevik said, we require an explanation. Chen looked at the holographic display. She looked at it for a moment with an expression that was perfectly calm. Then she looked back at Drevik. Of course, she said. What would you like to know? Several counselors spoke simultaneously. She waited for them to finish. What are those? Counselor Meth of the Keth Assembly said, pointing at the images. Those objects in your outer system, what are they? They are ships, Chen said. Ships. Meth stared at her. Those are not ships. Ships do not have a diameter of 9,000 kilometers. These do, Chen said. Leslie? The chamber erupted again. Chen stood in the center of it with her hands folded, waiting in no apparent hurry. Drevik raised his hand for quiet. Ambassador, how long have these vessels been constructed? The program began 31 years ago, Chen said. Construction was completed on the last vessel 14 months ago. 31 years, Drevik said the number carefully. For 31 years, humanity has been building a fleet of planet-sized warships in secret. Yes, and you did not inform the council. Chen tilted her head slightly. With respect, Counselor, we did not trust the council to keep a secret of this magnitude. We still don't. She said it without malice, the way you state a fact about weather. Too many member species, too many intelligence services, too many potential leaks. The chamber erupted a third time. Drevik let it run for a moment, then he raised his hand again. What are these ships built for, Ambassador? Lin Chen paused. It was a short pause, barely noticeable, then she said, you know what they're built for, say it plainly. The Vord, she said. The chamber went very quiet. The Vord was not a comfortable subject in council chambers. Most species knew the name. Most had seen the data from the outer rim surveys, the cold ruins, the stripped systems, the neat terrible absence where civilizations used to be. Most had also engaged in the very comfortable practice of looking at the trajectory data, noting that the Vord were very far away and moving very slowly, and concluding that this was a problem for another generation. The Vord, Drevik said, are a distant threat. Current projections place their arrival at the inner systems in. Current council projections, Chen said, are based on data that is 8 years old. She reached into the pocket of her jacket and produced a small data chip, which she set on the council chamber's central data reader, without being invited to. These are our projections, based on our survey data from the past 30 months. The holographic display changed. The 7 warships were replaced by a star map. The map showed the inner galaxy on one side, and sweeping in from the rim a shape like a dark tide. A line of consumed systems, each one marked with a timestamp, and in the top right corner, a date. The date was not far away. Drevik looked at it. He felt the floor of his assumptions drop out from under him. That cannot be right, he said. It is right, Chen said. They accelerated. We don't know why. Our best estimate is that they detected something in this direction. Resources, energy output, life signs at a scale that drew their attention. They began moving significantly faster 3 years ago. She looked at the map. That is why we summoned the entire program to full alert 8 months ago. That is why our drive tests were moved up. She paused. That is why Lieutenant Sarek found our ships earlier than we intended. Counselor Meth leaned forward. What do you mean earlier than you intended? Were you planning to reveal these ships to the Council? Yes, Chen said, when they were needed. She picked up her data chip from the reader. It appears that Point is arriving sooner than projected. Drevik stared at the date on the map. He looked at the dark tide sweeping in from the rim. He thought about 40 years of politics. About how to read situations, read people, read the room. He thought about how he had read humans for 6 years and understood now that he had read nothing at all. What are you asking the Council for, Ambassador? He said finally. Chen considered. Nothing, he said. We are not asking for anything. We are informing you, because you deserve to know, and because coordination of evacuation corridors for non-combatant populations will require Council cooperation. She picked up her notepad. Our fleet will handle the Vord. Your fleet, Meth said slowly. How many of these ships? 7, Chen said, plus support vessels. 7 ships against the Vord fleet. Meth shook his head. Ambassador, the Vord have consumed 14 civilizations. The intelligence data suggests their fleet numbers in the thousands. 7 ships, even ships of this size, cannot. You haven't seen what these ships can do, Chen said. She said it quietly. Not as a boast, the way you say something that is simply true. Then she thanked the Council for their time and left. On board UHS Colossus, Commander Sarah Voss received the report from Earth Command in her briefing room on Deck 1. She was 47 years old, with short gray hair and the sort of posture that suggested she had been solving hard problems for a very long time and had developed an efficient relationship with difficulty. She had commanded the Colossus for 4 years. She had been part of the overall program for 11. She read the report. She read the updated Vord trajectory data. She read the date. She set the report down and pressed her comm. All hands. This is the commander. Effective immediately, Colossus moves to combat readiness. All systems to active status. Drive cores at 20% power and climbing. We are on a 72-hour clock. She paused. You all know what we built this ship to do. Now, we get to do it. She released the comm. Through the view screen in her briefing room, the black of outer space stretched out in every direction, cold and quiet. 6 other ships were out there, invisible to her eyes, but she knew where they were. She had their coordinates memorized. 7 ships, 31 years of secret work. The Vord were coming. She was ready. Part 3. The Vord did not announce themselves. They did not send a signal. They did not issue a demand. They did not do any of the things that civilizations do when they intend to open a dialogue. They arrived at the Theris system, a Keth colony of 3 inhabited planets, and they began. The Theris system was gone in 9 days. The Keth sent their fastest ship to the Council with the sensor logs. The logs showed a fleet of approximately 4,000 vessels, none of them smaller than a Thari battlecruiser sweeping through the system in a formation that was less like a military advance and more like a tide. They didn't engage in combat in any recognizable way. They just moved forward, and when something was in front of them, they removed it, and then they moved forward again. 3 inhabited planets. 4 billion people. Gone. 9 days. The Council emergency session was held 20 hours after the Keth ship arrived. Every seat was full. The chamber smelled like fear, which turned out to have a very specific scent that varied only slightly across 47 species. It was the same for all of them. That was not a comforting observation. Drevik opened the session. He looked tired. He had not slept since receiving the Keth logs. The Vord fleet has entered map space, he said. The Theris system has been destroyed. Current trajectory places their next target as either the Morali home cluster or the outer Thari colonies. Possibly both simultaneously. He looked around the chamber. The combined Council defense fleet is assembling at Passage Point. We have approximately 900 warships that can be positioned within. Counselor Meth stood up. 900 warships were not enough to save the Veth. They were not enough to save the Drekon, or the Orel, or any of the 14 civilizations in those sensor logs. He pointed at the display. 900 warships against 4,000 Vord vessels is not a battle. It is a delay. Nobody argued with him. Ambassador Chen, Drevik said. Chen was in the back row as usual. She stood. She was the calmest person in the room, which was either reassuring or terrifying depending on how you thought about it. The human fleet is ready to deploy, she said. We need them now, Drevik said. Can they be at Passage Point? Our fleet will not assemble at Passage Point, Chen said. The engagement position has already been selected by our command team. We will intercept the Vord at the Cassian Gap. Drevik looked at the star map. The Cassian Gap was a wide region of sparse space between the Theris ruins and the inner systems, a natural choke point. A place where a fleet moving inward would have to pass through a defined corridor. It was smart positioning. It was very smart positioning for a species that had supposedly never fought a major space battle. Understood, he said. And the human fleet itself, when we say 7 vessels. 7 vessels, the chamber stirred. 7. Against 4,000. Drevik kept his expression still. He had decided, after the session when Chen had stood in the center of the chamber and said, "You haven't seen what this that he was going to extend humanity a large and unprecedented amount of trust. He was going to do this because he was a very experienced politician and a very experienced reader of situations, and every instinct he had told him that Lin Chen was not a person who said things she could not back up. He hoped his instincts were right. The Council Defense Fleet will hold a secondary position, he said. We will support the human engagement where possible. Chen nodded. We appreciate the support. Please keep your ships at minimum 80,000 kilometers from the engagement zone during the initial phase. She paused. Things are going to get very large very quickly. We would not want any friendly casualties. She sat back down and opened her notepad. Commander Voss received the deployment order while standing on the primary command deck of the Colossus, which was a room large enough to contain a sports stadium with room on the sides. The view through the forward transparent hull section showed the stars of the outer solar system cold and bright and utterly still. She pressed the fleet channel. All ships, this is Colossus Actual. We have our deployment order. We move on my mark to the Cassian Gap. Drive cores at 40% on departure, climbing to full power during transit. She looked at her navigation officer. Set jump coordinates already set, Commander. She looked at the stars ahead. For 31 years this fleet had been a secret, a program, a preparation. It had never fired its weapons in a real engagement. It had run simulations, thousands of them, but simulations were not real. Real was 9 days, real was 3 planets and 4 billion people. Mark, she said. All 7 ships vanished from the outer solar system simultaneously. At Passage Point, the Council Defense Fleet finished assembling. 912 warships, the largest military coalition in galactic history, representing 31 species and centuries of combined military tradition. Commodore Drev of the Theri Fleet Command stood on his bridge and watched the human fleet marker on the tactical display. 1 marker, moving fast, toward the Cassian Gap. 7 vessels. He had reviewed the Veneth's eye sensor data several times. He had looked at the weapons port counts. He had looked at the power readings. He was a military officer. He understood ships and weapons and force projections. He still did not quite believe what the numbers were telling him. The tactical display showed the Vord fleet moving in from the rim. 4,031 vessels confirmed, with potentially more arriving at the edge of sensor range. They were moving at a pace that was, for them, apparently relaxed. They had never encountered serious resistance. They had never needed to hurry. The human fleet marker closed on the Cassian Gap. One of Drev's officers looked up from her station. Commodore, the human marker is stopping at the gap. I see it. There is only 1 marker. I know. She hesitated. The Vord will reach the gap in approximately 14 hours, Drev nodded. He looked at the single human marker in the Cassian Gap, sitting in the dark between the Vord fleet and everything worth protecting. Get me everything we have on those 7 ships, he said. Power readings, mass, weapons yields, anything from the survey data. He paused. And get me a communication channel to the human flagship. Voss took the call on the command deck. Commodore Drev appeared on the comm screen. He was a solid-looking individual with the squared posture of career military. He was also looking at her with an expression she recognized, the expression of someone trying to calculate whether to feel reassured or terrified and not yet having reached a conclusion. Commander Voss, he said. Commodore Drev, Council Fleet Command. I wanted to make contact before the engagement. Commodore, she said. I have your tactical position and I have the Vord approach vector. I want to ask you directly. He paused. Can you do this? 7 vessels against their numbers. Voss considered the question. She thought about the simulations. She thought about the Colossus's primary weapons array, which had been tested once, at reduced power, against a decommissioned asteroid. The asteroid was no longer a coherent shape. She thought about 6 identical ships waiting in position across the gap. "We were built for this," she said. "Specifically for this. Nothing else." Drev looked at her for a moment. "Understood," he said. "Then, we will be at the secondary position you specified. If there is anything the Council fleet can contribute, keep your people clear of the engagement zone," Voss said. "When the fighting starts, the weapons fire is going to affect a large area. A very large area." She paused. "There will be slowly." "Good luck, Commander," he said. "Luck isn't what we built," Voss said. "But thank you." She closed the channel. She looked at the stars ahead. 14 hours. "All hands," she said into the fleet channel. "This is it." Part 4 The Vord arrived at the Cassian Gap exactly on schedule. They came in the formation they always used, a broad wave, spread across a wide front, moving forward at a steady pace. 40 centuries of destroying civilizations had never given them a reason to change what worked. The sensors on Voss's tactical screen showed them coming in as a mass of red markers, dense enough that the display had to compress them to fit. 4,000 ships. Maybe more at the edges of sensor range. A tide. On the tactical display, the 7 blue markers of the human fleet were spaced across the gap in a line, one every 1,200 kilometers. Voss stood on the command deck and watched the gap between red and blue close. Nobody spoke. The command crew sat at their stations and worked with the quiet precision of people who had trained for this for years. The Vord sensors must have detected the human fleet, because the tide slowed briefly. This was notable. In every recorded Vord engagement, they had never slowed for anything. They slowed now. Probably, Voss thought, because their sensors were telling them something they had never encountered before. Something they did not have a category for. She imagined their calculation. 7 objects, 9,000 kilometers each, sitting in a line across their path. The Vord paused for approximately 4 minutes. Then they moved forward again. They had consumed 14 civilizations. They were not afraid. "Range?" Voss said. 60,000 kilometers in closing, her weapons officer said. "They'll be in primary range in 3 minutes. All ships stand by. Fire on my mark only." She looked at the display. "Let them get close." The command deck was very quiet. The Vord fleet was close enough now that the forward optical arrays could pick up individual ships. They were large. The biggest of them perhaps 800 meters long, and they were dark and angular, built without elegance, built only to function. There were thousands of them, filling the optical feed from edge to edge. Voss looked at the density of the formation. "Mark," she said. The Colossus fired. The primary weapons array of a ship 9,000 kilometers across was not a single weapon. It was a system of interconnected rail platforms and energy projectors distributed across a hull surface the size of a small continent, all linked and fired simultaneously. The technical name was a distributed hull weapon system. The crew had a simpler name for it. They called it the broadside. When the Colossus fired its broadside, the energy output was equivalent to approximately 40% of the sun's daily output, channeled, focused, and directed in a spread pattern across a 60-degree arc. The first Vord wave stopped existing. This was not a figure of speech. The ships in the first wave, approximately 400 vessels, ceased to be intact objects and became instead a rapidly expanding region of debris and superheated gas. The energy release was visible to the naked eye across a distance of several light minutes. The 6 other human ships fired simultaneously. The gap lit up. On the bridge of the Theri command vessel at the secondary position, 80,000 kilometers away, Commodore Drev watched his forward optical screen go almost completely white. His comm officer said something that was not entirely professional. Drev didn't correct him. When the light dimmed slightly, the tactical display updated. 1,200 Vord ships, gone. In the first exchange. In seconds. The Vord fleet stopped completely. Drev had reviewed every recorded Vord engagement in the Council database. 14 civilizations' final records. He had watched the Vord absorb fire from desperate defensive fleets, without slowing, without reacting, without any sign that the resistance registered as meaningful. The Vord had stopped. For 11 seconds, the entire Vord fleet was motionless in space. Voss noted the pause on her display. She pressed the fleet channel. "All ships, reload primary arrays, secondary weapons free. Don't let them reorganize." The Colossus's secondary systems, railguns, missile platforms, energy cannons, were by any normal standard extremely powerful. By the Colossus's standards, they were light armament. They opened fire on the Vord fleet while the primary arrays recharged. The Vord responded. They were not incapable of fighting. They simply had never needed to fight anything that required this much of them. Their return fire was dense and intense. The accumulated weapons, technology of 14 consumed civilizations all directed toward the human line. Thousands of energy beams and projectiles crossed the gap simultaneously. The Colossus's armor absorbed it, 3 kilometers of composite hull material at its thinnest. The weapon's fire hit it, and the hull absorbed the energy, and the sensors logged the impacts, and the damage report read, hull temperature elevated in sectors 12 through 40, manageable. Voss read the damage report. How's our armor? Holding at 94% nominal, Commander. Good. On the Vord side, the fleet reorganized. They were adapting. They spread their formation wider, trying to flank the human line, probing for weak points in the coverage. They were coordinated and intelligent, and they had learned from 14 civilizations of warfare. They had not learned from this. They're going wide, her tactical officer said, trying to get around the flanks. They'll find the flanks, Voss said. They're not there yet. She looked at the spread of the Vord movement. Aegis and Rampart rotate 15 degrees outward. Open your arcs. The 2 flanking ships of the human line pivoted, their massive hulls turning like slow moons. The movement exposed a new firing angle across the Vord flanking attempt. The primary arrays recharged. Fire, Voss said. The gap lit up a second time. Cale Marsh watched the battle from a secondary viewport on deck 942. He was not supposed to be watching. He was supposed to be monitoring the power coupling diagnostic in Sector 8. But the diagnostic was running clean, and the battle was happening. And he pressed himself against the viewport glass and watched. He could see it with his naked eyes. The light from the weapon's fire was bright enough that it cast shadows inside the corridor. Each time the primary array fired, the corridor turned white for a moment like daylight, then dark, then white again. He could feel the hull absorb the incoming fire through his boots. Not vibration exactly, more like pressure. A deep, massive presence, like standing next to a waterfall and feeling the air move. The ship was 9,000 kilometers across, and it was holding. He pressed his hand flat against the hull and felt the ship breathing around him. The hum of the drive cores, the pulse of the weapon system cycling, the shudder of impacts that would have destroyed anything smaller and were doing nothing to this. He thought about Edmonton. He thought about his mother. He thought about how he had told everyone he worked on relay stations. The corridor turned white again. He stayed at the viewport. The battle lasted 6 hours and 40 minutes. The Vord did not retreat easily. Retreating was not something they had needed to do in 14 civilizations worth of warfare. They adapted, they probed, they reorganized repeatedly, searching for an answer to a problem they had never encountered. A defensive line they could not get through. They found no answer. In the 6th hour, the Vord fleet began to pull back. It was not a rout, it was a tactical withdrawal, disciplined, covering their retreat with intense rearguard fire. But it was backward. The Vord were moving away from something for the first time in recorded history. Voss watched the red markers on the tactical display pulling back from the gap. Her fleet had lost no ships. The Aegis had a section of armor damaged that would need replacing. The Sentinel had a secondary weapons platform offline. The Colossus had some hull heating in sectors 12 through 40, and a power coupling junction on deck 942 that had blown out during the sustained fire and would need replacing. She watched the Vord retreat. Do we pursue? Her tactical officer asked. Voss considered it. The Vord were withdrawing in good order. Pursuing would extend their engagement lines and reduce their coordinated coverage. It would also tell the Vord more about human fleet mobility than she wanted to reveal right now. We hold the gap, she said. Let them go. She pressed the fleet channel. All ships, cease fire, hold position, good work. She released the channel and looked at the damage tallies. The Vord had lost over 2,000 ships in 6 hours. Humanity had lost 0. She sat down for the first time in 6 hours. She accepted the cup of coffee her junior officer brought her without looking at it, drank it, and looked at the display where the red markers were retreating toward the rim. They would be back. She knew that. But now they knew what was here. Now everything was different. Part 5. The Galactic Council met 40 hours after the battle at the Cassian Gap. The chamber looked the same as it always did. Same seats, same recycled air, same ancient Veth architecture. But the energy in the room was completely different. Every species looked at the human seats differently. Some with relief so intense it bordered on weakness. Some with a kind of awe. Some, and Drevik noticed these and catalogued them carefully, with something harder and more calculating. The look of species that had just been reminded that they were not the most powerful force in known space, and were already deciding how they felt about that. Drevik opened the session. The Vord fleet has withdrawn to beyond the outer boundary markers, he said. Thari long-range surveillance is tracking them. They are not dispersing. They are reorganizing at the rim. He paused. We should expect them to return. Nobody argued with that. The human fleet remains at the Cassian Gap, he continued. They have declined to withdraw to home space. He looked at Ambassador Chen, who was in her usual seat in the back row. Ambassador, your fleet's losses. No ships lost, Chen said. Minor damage to 2 vessels. All 7 remain fully combat capable. The chamber was very quiet for a moment. Counselor Meth spoke first. How, he said, not as a question exactly, as something closer to a statement of confusion. Chen waited. How did you know, Meth said. How did you know to build those ships? How did you know what was coming when He stopped. We have been watching the Vord for 200 years. Our analysts concluded they were not an imminent threat. Your species has been spacefaring for 300 years total. How did you understand what we did not? Chen considered the question. She set her pen down on her notepad. You watched the Vord for 200 years, she said. You observed their trajectory, their rate of advance, their pattern of destruction, and you concluded that you had time. She paused. We watched the same data and asked a different question. We didn't ask how long until they arrive. We asked, has anything ever stopped them? She looked at Meth steadily. The answer was no. Nothing had ever stopped them. And from that answer, we drew a different conclusion than you did. Meth was quiet. We concluded, Chen said, that if we did not stop them ourselves, no one would. Drevik had spent 40 years reading rooms. He had a very precise sense for when something significant was being said. He felt it now, a kind of settling in the chamber, like a building finding its new weight after an earthquake. There are questions the Council needs answered, he said. The 7 ships, the weapons capability, the program timeline. If these assets are to be part of a coordinated galactic defense, they are not coordinated galactic defense assets, Chen said. Not harshly, plainly. They are human vessels, under human command. We will coordinate with the Council on positioning and strategy, but command authority remains with Commander Voss and Earth Central Command. The chamber stirred. The calculating species looked more calculating. And what does humanity want? A counselor from the far side of the chamber asked. In return, you didn't build 7 ships of that size out of pure altruism. No, Chen agreed. We built them because if the Vord reached Earth, Earth would be gone. That was our primary concern. She looked around the chamber. But to answer your question directly, we want recognition of our sovereign space claims. We want a permanent seat on the Security Council subcommittee, which we have been requesting for 4 years. And we want the Council database, the full database, not the summary package you share with junior members. You've been a member species for 6 years, the counselor said. Junior membership, we just held the Cassian Gap, Chen said. I think junior membership no longer applies. On the command deck of the Colossus, Commander Voss sat in her command chair and read the fleet status reports, damage assessments, resupply requests, a long technical document about the armor sections in need of repair on the Aegis, a short message from Earth Central Command that contained exactly 2 words, well done. She had been awake for 31 hours. She had drunk enough coffee that her junior officers had started rationing it without telling her, which she had noticed and chosen not to address. She looked at the tactical display. The Vord fleet was far at the rim, deep in the dark. Not gone, never gone. Reorganizing, adapting, calculating. They were an ancient machine civilization. They had been doing this for longer than most species had existed. They were patient in a way that biological life could not quite match. They would recalculate, and they would return, and they would come differently. But they had retreated. For the first time in recorded history, they had retreated. Something had changed. She thought about what that meant. She thought about the 14 consumed civilizations, each of them probably watching the Vord come and calculating that they had time, or calculating that something would stop them, or calculating anything other than, we will do this ourselves. She thought about 31 years of construction, 31 years of secrecy in metal and power couplings replaced in maintenance corridors 900 decks deep by people like K.L. Marsh who told their families they were working on relay stations. 31 years of choosing to do this themselves. She pressed the fleet channel. Status report from all ships. One by one, the other commanders checked in. Aegis, Titan, Rampart, Bastion, Sentinel, Bulwark, all present, all holding, all ready. She released the channel. Through the forward viewport, the stars of the Cassian Gap were quiet. The debris from the battle was still out there, spreading slowly. The remains of 2,000 Vord ships. The first things the Vord had ever lost. The first time the tide had ever been pushed back. She thought, they will write about this. In 1,000 years, in 10,000 years, in whatever records survive, and something always survives. Someone will write about this battle and about the ships that held this line. She hoped they would get the names right. Cale Marsh finally found out his power coupling on Deck 942 had blown out during the battle when the damage report reached his section supervisor. He went to replace it. That was his job. He gathered his tools and floated through the corridor. The enormous corridor, 40 meters wide, 20 high, which he had stopped finding remarkable 2 years ago, and opened the access panel and looked at the fused coupling. It had blown from the sustained load during the battle. The diagnostics showed it had held for the first 4 hours and then given out in the 5th. He looked at the scorch marks on the housing and thought about what it meant that this was the damage profile. Held 4 hours, gave out in the 5th, repaired in 30 minutes. He pulled the fuse coupling free and set it aside. He picked up a replacement from his kit. Above him, through the viewport, the stars were still. The battle was over. The Vord were gone. The gap was quiet and enormous, and full of the cold dark that space was always full of. Impartial and ancient and indifferent to everything that had just happened in it, humanity had held the line. He thought about his sister's kids. He thought about Edmonton and hockey and coffee. He thought about the papers he had signed without reading carefully, and how they had led him here, to this corridor, in this ship, in this moment that history was probably already busy writing down. He slotted the replacement coupling into the housing, felt it click. He pressed the diagnostic panel, green light, running clean. He sealed the access panel and gathered his tools and pressed his hand flat against the hull for a moment, the way he had during the battle. The hull was warm from the fight. It would cool. 9,000 kilometers of metal and engineering, built in secret over 31 years by 12 billion people who had looked at an ancient machine coming to erase them and decided, no. He took his hand away. He floated toward the transit shaft, because his supervisor was already pinging him about the next set of couplings on Deck 943, and the ship needed maintaining, and there was still a great deal of work to do. The galaxy outside was different now. He didn't know all the ways it was different yet. Nobody did. But the ship was still here. The line still held. The Colossus breathed around him, 9,000 kilometers of quiet purpose, sitting in the gap between the Vord and everything worth protecting. He went to work. Councillor Drevik of the Theri Confederacy had been in politics for 40 years. He had survived 3 regime changes, 2 border wars, and 1 trade dispute so complicated it required its own permanent arbitration station. He had shaken hands with heads of state, sat across tables from warlords, and negotiated with species whose concept of agreement was fundamentally different from his own. He was, by any reasonable measure, not a person who could be easily surprised. Lieutenant Sarek surprised him. The young scout pilot stood at the center of the council chamber and delivered his report in a flat, careful voice. The kind of voice you use when the facts are so large that the only way to present them without sounding unstable is to say each word with the same weight as the word before it. He had clearly rehearsed. He had clearly rehearsed many times. The holographic display behind him showed the optical imaging from the Veneth's eye. 7 shapes, each one roughly 9,000 kilometers across. Dark gray hulls dotted with structures that rose 60 and 70 kilometers from the surface. And across those hulls, at regular, designed intervals, thousands of circular openings that the ship's instruments had identified as weapons ports. When Sarek finished, the chamber was completely silent. Then all 47 species started talking at once. Drevik sat very still. He was looking at the images. He was doing what experienced politicians do when they realize they have misread a situation at a fundamental level. He was recalculating, going back through everything he thought he knew, and looking at it again with different eyes. 12 warships. He had read that assessment 3 years ago and filed it without a second thought. 12 small warships, a young, primitive species barely worth monitoring. He had watched humans sit in the back row of this chamber for 6 years and found them mildly entertaining, in the way that young, enthusiastic things are mildly entertaining. He looked at the images. 9,000 kilometers each. "Summon Ambassador Chen," he said. His voice cut through the noise in the chamber. The noise stopped. Today. No delays. Ambassador Lin Chen arrived at Convergence Point Station 14 hours after the summons. She came alone. Single diplomatic cruiser, the same modest vessel humanity always used. She was wearing the same practical gray jacket she wore to most sessions. She had her notepad. She walked into the full council chamber, every seat occupied, which happened only during crises, and she smiled at everyone in the room. Drevik had watched humans smile many times over the past 6 years. He had always interpreted it as warmth, friendliness, an expression of the somewhat excessive openness that seemed to be built into human social interaction. Watching Chen walk calmly toward the center of a chamber, full of alarmed and angry senior representatives from 47 civilizations, with the images of 7 planet-sized warships displayed on the holographic screen behind her. He understood for the first time that a smile could mean something else entirely. It could mean, "I have been ready for this conversation for years. I have been waiting for you to catch up." She reached the center of the chamber. She looked at the images on the display for a moment. Then she looked at Drevik. "Ambassador Chen," he said, "we require an explanation." "Of course," she said. "What would you like to know?" Several counselors spoke simultaneously. She waited for them to finish. She did not fidget. She did not look around the room. She simply waited with the patience of someone who had all the time she needed. Counselor Meth of the Keth Assembly spoke first when the noise settled. He was pointing at the display. "What are those objects?" "Ships," Chen said. "Ships," Meth repeated. He looked at the images. "Those are not ships. Ships do not have a diameter of 9,000 kilometers. "These do," Chen said. The chamber erupted again. Drevik raised his hand and waited. The noise lowered to a level at which conversation was possible. "How many?" Drevik said. 7, Chen said. "When were they built?" "Construction began 31 years ago," she said. "The last vessel was completed 14 months ago." The number landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. 31 years. Drevik did the math without wanting to. 31 years ago, humanity had been admitted to no council. They had barely reached their outer planets. They had been, by any galactic standard, children with rockets, and they had already started building. "For 31 years," Drevik said carefully, "humanity has been constructing a fleet of this scale in secret, without informing the council." "Yes," Chen said. "Why?" Counselor Peva of the Morali spoke from the 3rd tier, her secondary vocal cords giving the word a sharper edge than she probably intended. "Why secret? Why not come to the council? Why not share what you were building with the rest of the galaxy?" Chen paused. When she spoke, she chose her words with the same care that Sarek had used delivering his report. "Because we needed it to stay secret," she said. "The council has 47 member species. Each of those species has a government. Each government has an intelligence service. Each intelligence service has agents, informants, and the possibility of data leaks." She looked around the chamber. "We were not willing to risk that. Not for this." "For this," Peva repeated. "What, specifically, is this?" Chen reached into her jacket and produced a small data chip. She set it on the central data reader without being asked to. The holographic display changed. The 7 warships were replaced by a star map, the inner galaxy on the right side, and sweeping in from the left, a dark mass moving along a line of consumed dead systems. Each destroyed system was marked with a timestamp, the Vord. "This is our updated intelligence on the Vord fleet," Chen said, "based on our own long-range survey data from the past 30 months. Drevik looked at the map. The Vord were not a new concern. Every major civilization in the council had survey data going back decades. They knew about the consumed systems. They knew about the dark tide moving in from the rim. They had discussed it in sessions, commissioned reports, formed subcommittees. The subcommittees had concluded that the threat was distant and the timeline was long, and there was time to develop a coordinated response at an appropriate future date. He looked at the date displayed in the corner of Chen's map. It was not a future date. It was not distant. The number he was looking at was months, not years. "That cannot be right," he said. "It is right," Chen said. The Vord accelerated. 3 years ago, their pace of advance increased significantly. Our best analysis suggests they detected something in this direction. Energy output, life signs, the electromagnetic noise of 47 civilizations, at a sufficient scale to attract their attention. She looked at the map. Our updated projections, based on their current velocity, placed their first contact with map council space within 4 months. Possibly sooner. The chamber was very quiet. "This is why our program timeline moved up," Chen continued. "When we confirmed the acceleration, we moved everything to full alert. Drive tests, weapon system calibrations, crew deployment. The construction we had planned to complete over the next 2 years was compressed into 11 months. She paused. "That is also why your lieutenant found our ships earlier than intended. We were not yet ready for the reveal. The timeline did not cooperate." Counselor Meth leaned forward in his seat. "You have known this for how long?" "The acceleration. When did you confirm it?" 2 years and 4 months ago," Chen said. The silence that followed had a different quality than the earlier silences. This one was colder. 2 years, Meth said. "You confirmed an existential acceleration in the Vord advance 2 years ago and said nothing to the council." "We said nothing to anyone," Chen said. "For the same reasons as before. We could not risk the information reaching the Vord. We could not risk a galactic panic that would interfere with our construction timeline. And," she paused, And for the first time in the session, something that was not quite perfectly controlled moved across her face. And because there was nothing the Council could have done with the information that would have helped. The room stirred. That is an extraordinary thing to say, Drevik said, that the combined resources of 47 civilizations could not have helped. I am not saying the Council is without resources, Chen said. I am saying that the kind of help needed, ships of this scale, capable of stopping the Vord rather than merely delaying them, could not be built in the time remaining. We had a 30-year head start. No combined emergency program launched today could replicate what we have already built in the time available. She met Drevik's eyes. We are not dismissing you. We are simply being honest about the arithmetic. Drevik sat with that for a moment. He was a politician, he understood arithmetic. He also understood, with a clarity that was slightly uncomfortable, that the humans had been doing this arithmetic for 31 years. Quietly, alone, while sitting in the back row and taking notes and smiling at everyone, and drinking their coffee and learning everything they could about everyone. What are you asking from the Council? He said. Cooperation on evacuation corridors, Chen said immediately. If we engage the Vord and the engagement is not immediately decisive, civilian populations in the outer systems will need to move. We need Council logistic support for those movements. She opened her notepad. She had, apparently, already drafted a list. We also need access to the Council's deep-range sensor network. Our own long-range arrays are very good, but the Council network has wider coverage and we would like real-time data sharing during the engagement. And in return, Councillor Piva asked. We hold the line, Chen said. The simplicity of it sat in the room. Drevik looked at the map, the dark tide from the rim, the timeline. He looked at the 7 blue markers that Chen had placed on the display, positioned in the Cassian Gap. The natural choke point between the Vord's current position and the inner systems, 7 ships. He thought about what he had seen in the survey imaging. The hull sections, the weapons ports, the power readings that his analysts had told him, in a brief and somewhat shaken report that morning, exceeded anything in the Council's combined database. He made a decision. It was the largest decision he had made in 40 years of politics, and he made it quickly, which was itself a kind of answer about how large the stakes were. The Council will cooperate on evacuation corridors, he said, and we will share sensor network access. He looked around the chamber. He was not asking for votes. He was stating a position and daring someone to argue with it. Nobody argued. The Council Defense Fleet will assemble at Passage Point as a secondary force. We will not interfere with your engagement, but we will be positioned to assist in any way that becomes useful. Chen nodded. She wrote something in her notepad. One more question, Ambassador, Drevik said. Your commander, the officer in charge of this fleet, who is she? Commander Sarah Voss, Chen said. She has commanded the lead vessel for 4 years. She has been part of the program for 11. What is she like? Chen considered. She is very calm, she said. She has been waiting a long time for this. I believe she is ready. Commander Sarah Voss received the deployment authorization from Earth Central Command while sitting at her desk on the primary command deck of the Colossus, reading 2 reports simultaneously and drinking what her junior officers had privately agreed was too much coffee. The authorization was brief, a timestamp, a set of coordinates, 4 words at the bottom. Fleet is cleared to engage. She set it down. She had been part of this program for 11 years. She had watched the ships take shape from nothing. She had seen the drives tested, the weapons calibrated, the armor rated, the simulations run 10,000 times in every configuration the scenario teams could devise. She had read every piece of Vord intelligence the Human Survey Network had collected over 30 years, and she knew the Vord better than most species knew their neighbors. She was not afraid. She was something closer to ready in a way that had been building for so long it felt almost like calm. She pressed the fleet-wide channel. All 7 ships listened. All hands. This is Commander Voss aboard Colossus. We have our authorization and our coordinates. She paused. For 11 years this fleet has been a secret and a program and a preparation. Today it becomes something else. Another pause. Set course for the Cassian Gap. Drive cores to 40% on departure. Full combat readiness. All hands to stations. She released the channel. Through the forward viewport, the outer solar system was dark and cold and quiet. Jupiter was a bright point far to the inner system. The sun was a star among stars. It was, she thought, a good view. She had spent a lot of hours looking at it. She looked at it one more time. Navigation, she said. Jump coordinates? Set and ready, Commander. All ships confirm ready? One by one, the other 6 commanders checked in. Each one calm. Each one ready. 31 years of this. 31 years of building and hiding and waiting. The waiting was over. Jump, Voss said. All 7 ships vanished from the outer solar system, leaving behind only cold space and the faint residual heat of enormous drive cores which would disperse and cool and leave no trace at all within a few hours, as if they had never been there. As if nothing had ever been hidden in this dark. At Passage Point, Commodore Drev of the Thari fleet finished reading the human briefing packet that Ambassador Chen had transmitted through council channels following the session. It contained the technical specifications of the 7 ships. He read it once, he put it down, he read it again. He called his senior staff together and they went through it section by section. Armor specifications, drive output, weapons yield, sensor range, crew complement. He watched his officers' faces as they read, and he saw in those faces the same sequence of expressions he had gone through himself. Professional assessment, recalibration, something very close to awe. 11,000 crew per ship. He kept coming back to that number. 11,000 people maintaining a hull 9,000 kilometers across. 11,000 people who had worked in total secrecy for years, in the cold dark of the outer solar system, keeping this secret from the rest of the galaxy. 11,000 people per ship. 77,000 humans total. Across all 7 vessels, 77,000 people who knew exactly what they were building and why, and had said nothing to anyone outside the program. He thought about what that said about humans. He had spent 6 years in council sessions, and like Drevik, like all of them, he had read humanity as a young species, harmless, eager, still learning. He had found them interesting in the abstract way you find all new species interesting. Novel, worth watching, not yet a factor worth calculating seriously in any strategic assessment. He looked at the technical specifications. He thought about what humans had actually been doing for the past 31 years, while everyone else was finding them charming and mildly amusing. He put the documents down and looked at his staff. "Get me everything on the Cassian Gap," he said. "Tautology, approach vectors, sensor coverage, everything. If Commander Voss has positioned her fleet there, I want to understand why." He paused. "And someone get me a communication channel to the Colossus. I want to speak with their commander before this begins." He looked out his view screen at the stars of Passage Point. Far in the direction of the rim, the Vord were still moving, patient, ancient, unstoppable as they had always been, or so everyone had believed. He was no longer sure what he believed. The Vord did not announce themselves, they sent no signal, they issued no demand. They did not do any of the things civilizations do when they intend to talk. They simply arrived at the edge of mapped council space and began doing what they had always done, in the same way they had always done it, because nothing had ever given them a reason to do it differently. The Theris system was a Keth colony. 3 inhabited planets, combined population of 4 billion. It's at the outer boundary of map space, which was why it was hit first. The Keth had 6 defense stations in the system and a garrison fleet of 80 ships. Their senior commander, a decorated officer named Feln, sent a distress signal the moment Vord ships began appearing on long-range sensors. The signal described the Vord fleet as numerous beyond immediate count, advancing without deviation, not responding to hails. That was the last signal anyone received from the Theris system. The Keth sent their fastest courier ship to retrieve the sensor logs from the outer system buoys. The courier arrived at Convergence Point Station 36 hours later, carrying the complete record of what had happened to Theris. The record was 11 minutes long. After the first 90 seconds, Feln's voice disappeared from the audio track. After 4 minutes, the sensor buoys in the inner system went dark one by one. By the 11-minute mark, there was nothing left to record. 3 planets, 4 billion people, 80 warships, 6 defense stations, 11 minutes. The council emergency session was called within hours of the courier's arrival. Every seat was full. The chamber smelled like fear, which turned out to be a scent that did not vary much across 47 species. It was the same recognizable animal thing under all of them, regardless of what biology produced it. Drevik had smelled it before, in other crises over his 40 years. He had never smelled it this strongly. He stood at the front of the chamber and played the sensor log once, just once. Playing it twice would have accomplished nothing except additional horror. When it ended, nobody spoke for a moment. Then Counselor Pava of the Morali stood. She was trying to hold her voice steady and mostly succeeding. "The outer Morali colonies are directly in the projected path," she said. "We have 60 million people in those systems. I need to know." She stopped, started again. "I need to know what we can put between the Vord and those colonies." "The combined Council Defense Fleet is assembling at Passage Point," Drevik said. 912 warships as of 2 hours ago. More arriving. Commodore Drev has operational command. He paused. "And the human fleet is already in position at the Cassian Gap." The room moved at the mention of the human fleet. Not quite a stir. Something heavier than a stir. 7 ships, Counselor Meth said. He said it quietly, almost to himself, the way you repeat a number you are trying to make feel real. 7 ships, Drevik confirmed. Commander Voss has positioned them across the gap. She has declined to advance further toward the Vord formation. She's waiting for them to come to her, Meth said. Yes. Meth looked at the star map on the display. The Cassian Gap was clearly marked. The human fleet's position, one small cluster of blue markers, sat in the center of the choke point. Can they hold it? 7 ships against a Vord fleet that just took apart an entire system in 11 minutes? Drevik did not answer immediately. He thought about Ambassador Chen standing in this chamber and saying, "Without drama or boast, you haven't seen what these ships can do." He thought about the technical specifications Drev had shared with the senior council commanders. He thought about weapons yields he didn't have a good frame of reference for. "I don't know," he said, which was the honest answer. But the human commander is not moving. She positioned her fleet and she is holding the position. That suggests confidence. Or stubbornness, Piva said. Perhaps both, Drevik said. In the meantime, evacuation corridors for the outer colonies need to be opened immediately. All council logistics resources are to be directed toward civilian movement. That is not a suggestion. The session continued for another 4 hours. Plans were made, resources were allocated. Evacuation orders went out to 17 systems in the projected Vord path. The Council Defense Fleet at Passage Point was given new positioning orders to cover the evacuation routes. Throughout all of it, the 7 blue markers in the Cassian Gap held perfectly still. Commodore Drev had his communication with Commander Voss 48 hours before the Vord fleet was projected to reach the gap. He had expected a conversation about tactics, numbers, positions, angles of approach, weapons ranges. He was a military officer and so presumably was she. The conversation was not exactly about tactics. Voss appeared on his comm screen looking like someone who had been awake a long time and was not particularly bothered by it. She was perhaps 45, perhaps 50, with short gray hair and the kind of posture that had been built from years of carrying responsibility without letting it show. She looked at Drev the way experienced officers look at each other across a first meeting, taking measure, making calculations. "Commodore," she said, "Commander, I wanted to coordinate before the engagement. The Council fleet is positioned at Passage Point. If your line needs support, I want your fleet to stay at 80,000 kilometers from our engagement zone minimum," she said. Not rudely, directly. "The weapons fire is going to affect a large area. I don't want friendly casualties from our own broadside spread." Drev paused. "Understood. But if your line is breached, it won't be. Again, direct, not arrogant. The way you say something that is simply a fact you have prepared very thoroughly for. I want to be clear with you, Commodore, because I think you deserve clarity before this starts. Our ships are not designed to share an engagement zone with conventional warships. The scale of fire we are going to bring is not compatible with mixed fleet operation. Your 900 ships would be at significant risk from our own weapons output if they were inside our engagement radius." Drev stared at her. "Your own weapons output would endanger 900 allied warships. At close range, yes. This is not a small engagement." She paused. "Keep your fleet on the evacuation corridor. If the Vord somehow get past us, which they won't, your ships will be critical for buying time during civilian movement. That is the role I would assign your fleet." Drev looked at her steadily. He was trying to decide whether Commander Voss was the most confident person he had ever spoken to or the most professionally dangerous, and he was arriving at the conclusion that these were probably not mutually exclusive. "I have read your ship's technical specifications," he said. "Good. I have some difficulty," he paused. He was a military officer. He chose his words carefully. "I have some difficulty calibrating what I read against anything in my existing frame of reference. The weapons yields, the armor ratings, the drive output." He paused again. "Those specifications are not what I would call conventional." Something that might have been a brief smile crossed Voss's face. "No," she said, "they aren't." "How confident are you, Commander?" "Honestly." Voss was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of uncertainty. The quiet of someone selecting the precise true thing to say from among several options. "We ran over 12,000 simulations," she said. "Every Vord fleet configuration we could model. Every engagement scenario. The ships performed in all of them. Not always quickly, not always cleanly, but they performed." She looked at him through the screen. "We didn't build these ships to hold the line temporarily. We built them to win. That is a specific thing. It means our weapons can penetrate their armor at every tested range. It means our armor can absorb their weapons at sustained rates. It means 7 ships at the gap can handle what is coming. And if the simulations don't match reality, then we will adapt, she said. That is what we do. Drev nodded slowly. He thought about the 11-minute sensor log from Theris. He thought about 4 billion people and 80 warships and 6 defense stations and 11 minutes. Good luck, Commander, he said. Thank you, Commodore. Keep your people safe. The channel closed. Drev sat for a moment at his comm station. His adjutant, a young officer named Sevik, was standing nearby pretending to check a report he had clearly already read. What do you think? Sevik asked. Drev thought about the specifications. He thought about Voss's face when she said we built them to win. He thought about 31 years of secret construction and 11,000 people per ship who had held that secret. I think, he said, that we have profoundly underestimated humanity for a very long time. He stood. And I think we are about to find out exactly how much. On the Colossus, Kale Marsh had been at full combat readiness for 18 hours. Full combat readiness on a ship of this size meant, among other things, that all non-essential personnel were at secondary stations away from the outer hull sections. Kale's secondary station was a monitoring post on deck 712, in the inner core of the ship, well away from any of the exterior armor zones. He had a console, a chair, a viewport that looked into a vast internal maintenance shaft rather than into space, and the same recycled coffee as everywhere else on the ship. He was monitoring power flow to the secondary weapons platforms in his sector. It was important work. It was also, he was honest with himself, not very exciting work compared to what he knew was happening outside. He kept his eyes on the console. The ship around him was not quiet. 11,000 people at combat readiness was not quiet. Through the walls and the floor and the ceiling he could feel the Colossus as something alive and alert. The hum of the drive cores running warm, the low vibration of weapons systems cycling through pre-fire diagnostics, the occasional deep thud of internal pressure doors sealing into combat configuration. He had never felt the ship like this before. In 2 years of maintenance work, the Colossus had always felt like a large, patient, waiting thing. Now it felt like something waking up. His console showed the power levels in the secondary platforms steady and green. He checked them again, pulled up the tertiary diagnostic and checked that too. Across the aisle from him, an engineer named Priya was doing the same with her own set of platform readings. She was 24 from Chennai and had been on the ship for 8 months. She had the look of someone trying very hard to appear calmer than she was. You know what I keep thinking about, she said, not looking up from her console. What? My parents think I work on a communications relay, she paused. They were really proud. My dad told everyone in his neighborhood. Kale looked at the side of her face. What did you tell them you were doing out here? Deep space signal infrastructure. She finally looked up. They bought me a very nice watch before I left, to commemorate the achievement. That's nice. It is a very good watch. She looked back at her console. I hope I get to show it to them. Kale understood what she was really saying. He looked at his own console, power levels steady, green across the board. We will, he said. He meant it, not as comfort, as something he actually believed, in the bones of him, after 2 years of working on this ship. After 2 years of learning, slowly and inevitably, what this ship was capable of. Priya nodded. She straightened in her chair. The ship's internal announcement system clicked on. Commander Voss's voice, calm and clear, filling every corridor and compartment and monitoring station from the outer hull to the inner core. All hands, Vord fleet is entering sensor range. Primary array is hot. We are 30 minutes from engagement range. A pause, the kind of pause that is not empty. You know what this ship is. You helped build it. You've maintained it. You've kept it ready for this. Another pause. Now we find out what it can do. All stations hold. Weapons are on my mark only. The announcement clicked off. Kale looked at his console, green. All green. He thought about Edmonton. He thought about his sister, his mother, his nephew, who had just learned to walk and who Kale had last seen in a video call 3 months ago, pulling himself up against a couch cushion with the intensely serious expression of someone accomplishing something enormous. He thought about all 12 billion of them, back there in the inner system, in the warm blue light of a star that did not know what was coming toward it and would not know, because something was going to be standing in the way. He kept his eyes on the console. At Passage Point, the Council fleet watched the tactical display. 912 warships, the largest military coalition in recorded galactic history, sitting 80,000 kilometers from the Cassian Gap, watching a battle that had not yet started. The Vord fleet was visible on the long-range sensors as a mass of red markers so dense the display software had trouble rendering individual ships. The count updated every few minutes as more of the fleet came into sensor range. 4,000, 4,100, 4,200 and growing. And in the gap, across a line 12,000 kilometers wide, 7 blue markers. Motionless, Drev stood on his bridge and watched the two forces close on each other. Officers moved around him with the efficient quiet of people who were ready to do their jobs and were very aware that their jobs might change dramatically in the next hour. "Commodore," his sensor officer said. "The human ships, their power readings are changing." Drev looked at his display. The energy signatures from the 7 blue markers had been high since they arrived. Higher than anything in his database. Higher than he had known what to do with. But now they were climbing. The output curves were going up in a way that his display had to rescale twice to accommodate. "They're powering primary weapons," he said. "Yes, sir. We've never seen readings like." The sensor officer stopped. She looked at her display. She looked at the readings again. "Commodore, if these numbers are correct, they are correct. If these numbers are correct, then when those ships fire—" "I know," Drev said. "That is why we are 80,000 kilometers away." The red markers continued advancing. The blue markers held. Drev watched the gap between them close on his display. His hands were clasped behind his back. He was a military officer. He had made his hands stay still through harder things than this. He was not entirely sure that was true, but he kept them still anyway. The distance closed. The Vord had consumed 14 civilizations. They had never stopped. They had never retreated. They had never encountered anything that made them hesitate. 7 blue markers in a line across a gap in empty space. He watched. He waited. All 912 ships of the Council fleet waited with him. Engines ready, weapons armed, watching the display, watching the gap between red and blue, close down to nothing. Then the gap lit up. The gap lit up. There was no other way to describe it. One moment the Cassian gap was dark empty space between two forces closing on each other. Then the 7 human ships fired and the gap became something else entirely. A region of space that was, briefly and completely, not dark at all. The light reached Drev's bridge before any of the instrument data did. It came through the forward viewport as a white wall, total and immediate, bright enough that the viewport's automatic filters slammed to maximum opacity in under a second, and still let through more light than was comfortable to look at. Officers flinched. Someone dropped a data tablet. Drev did not flinch, but it took effort. The specific effort of someone who had decided in advance that he was not going to flinch, and was now being tested on that decision by something significantly brighter than he had anticipated. Then the filters compensated and the light was just very bright rather than blinding, and the instrument panel started updating, and the data came in. The first Vord wave was gone. Not damaged, not disabled, gone. 411 ships that the sensors had been tracking as individual contacts were now a single expanding region of superheated debris moving outward at several thousand kilometers per second. The instruments were still recalculating because the instruments had been designed to track ships, and what they were now tracking was not ships anymore. It was gas and metal fragments and radiation, spreading through the gap in a perfect sphere, lit from within by temperatures that the display had to switch to scientific notation to express. Drev's sensor officer said something that was not a professional observation. Drev did not correct her. He stared at the display. "Update," he said. "Vord fleet count, revised down by 411 contacts, Commodore." A pause. "Confirmed. 411 contacts destroyed in the initial exchange." "Time on that exchange?" Another pause. 4 seconds, sir." 4 seconds. Drev looked at the display. The surviving Vord fleet, still more than 3,000 ships, had done something it had apparently never done in 14 civilizations of warfare. It had stopped. The entire Vord formation was motionless in space, not reorganizing, not advancing, not retreating. Simply stopped. The way you stop when your understanding of a situation requires complete revision before you can decide what to do next. The 7 blue markers in the gap had not moved. They were recharging. On the Colossus command deck, Voss read the first damage reports while the primary array cycled through its recharge sequence. The Vord return fire had started less than 2 seconds after the human broadside landed. Thousands of ships, their accumulated weapons technology from 14 consumed civilizations, all directed at the human line simultaneously. The sheer volume of fire was, by any conventional measure, enormous. The armor was holding. Hull temperature elevated in outer sectors 12 through 40, her damage officer read. Tracking within acceptable range. Armor integrity at 97% nominal. Aegis reports 95%. Minor heating in their forward sections. Within spec. Good. She looked at the tactical display. The Vord formation was still stationary. She noted the pause with one part of her attention and spent another part on the recharge clock. How long on primary recharge? 1 minute 40 seconds. She nodded. Open secondary weapons free across all ships. Don't let them sit still. The secondary weapons systems of a ship 9,000 kilometers across were, by any conventional military standard, extremely powerful. They were also, by the Colossus's own standards, light armament, the systems used for precision work, for engaging smaller targets, for sustained fire between primary salvos, rail platforms, energy cannons, missile banks large enough to cover several square kilometers of space in overlapping fields. All 7 ships opened up with secondaries simultaneously. The gap lit up again, differently this time. Not the single white wall of the broadside, but a continuous cross-hatching of fire. Thousands of individual beams and projectiles pouring outward from 7 positions along the line, covering the space in front of the human fleet with a density of fire that the Vord had never encountered from any defensive position. Vord ships began taking damage. The second wave of contacts that had been moving up behind the destroyed first wave took the brunt of it. They were not destroyed the way the first wave had been destroyed, but they were damaged, and some of them stopped moving, and more than 100 of them became debris before the Vord formation adapted and began spreading. The Vord were not simple machines, they were intelligent. They had been doing this for a very long time, and they had learned, over the course of 14 civilizations worth of warfare, how to adapt to resistance. They spread their formation wide, extending their flanks, trying to get around the edges of the human line. They pushed harder in the center, concentrating fire on the lead ship, the Colossus, with the logic of any competent military commander. If you cannot go around, go through the strongest point and see if it breaks. The Colossus did not break. The Vord fire was intense, more intense, Voss noted, than anything the simulations had modeled at this fleet density. The simulations had been built on the best available intelligence, but Vord fleet configurations at this scale were not something humanity had observed at close range before. They were putting out more energy than projected. The armor was still holding. Hull temperature in outer sectors climbing, the damage officer said. Sectors 12 through 40 are now at 62% of thermal limit, still within operating range. Watch those sectors, Voss said. If we approach 80%, I want to know immediately. Yes, Commander. She looked at the recharge clock, 40 seconds. She looked at the tactical display. The Vord flanking attempt was extending. They were trying to go around the ends of the human line. Aegis and bulwark. Rotate 15 degrees outboard. Open your angles. On either end of the human line, 2 ships the size of small moons pivoted. They were not fast. Nothing that large moves quickly, but they moved with a steadiness that had its own kind of weight to it. Their rotation exposed new firing arcs across the extending Vord flanks. The flanking ships ran into the new coverage and stopped gaining ground. The gap was a continuous field of fire now, Vord weapons coming in and human secondaries going out, crossing in the space between the 2 fleets in a density that made the region between them look almost solid on the optical feed. Drev, watching from 80,000 kilometers away, had ordered his forward viewports dimmed twice. 20 seconds on primary recharge. 10. Primary arrays ready, the weapons officer said. Voss looked at the tactical display. The Vord had redistributed after the first broadside. They were more spread out now, which was smart. It would reduce the kill count on the second salvo compared to the first. It was still going to be significant. All ships primary fire, she said. Spread pattern, wide dispersion. Hit the flanks. The gap became white again. Kale felt it through his boots. He was at his monitoring console on deck 712 when the second broadside fired. And the feeling that went through the hull was not a vibration exactly. It was bigger than vibration, lower than vibration, the kind of thing that lives in your chest rather than your ears. A deep, full-body thud that lasted about a second and then was gone. He looked at his power flow readings. The draw during the broadside was enormous. The numbers spiked so high they went briefly off his console's display scale, then came back down as the primary array discharged, and the secondary systems picked up the load again. Across the aisle, Priya was gripping the edge of her console with both hands. Not out of panic, Kale thought. Just something to hold. Second salvo, she said. Second salvo, he confirmed. The power draw on that. She looked at her readings. That is a very large number, yes. Every time it fires, it uses as much power as... She paused, doing math. I don't actually have anything to compare that to. Me neither, he said. I stopped trying to compare things about 14 months ago. His console showed the secondary weapons platforms in his sector running steady and hot, maintaining continuous fire between the main salvos. The power flow was high but stable, which was what he was there to monitor. Everything in his sector was running exactly as it should. He was doing his job. He was part of this. He thought about that for a moment. in the way you sometimes think about something simple and obvious that suddenly feels larger than it did before. 11,000 people on this ship, every one of them doing exactly their job. Power coupling replacements and diagnostic checks and console monitoring. And 100 other small, precise things, all of them adding up to a ship that could do what it was doing right now to the Vord fleet on the other side of that hull. He checked his readings, all green. He kept watching. The battle had been running for 3 hours when the Vord changed their approach. Voss noted it the moment it showed on the tactical display. The Vord formation, which had been pressing forward into the flanks, shifted. The pressure in the center reduced. The flanking attempts pulled back slightly. Instead, the Vord fleet began concentrating its fire more selectively, not spreading across all 7 ships equally, but rotating targeting priority between ships in a rapid sequence, trying to overwhelm one ship's armor faster than it could dissipate heat. It was a smart adaptation. She was not surprised they had made it. She had been waiting for it. "They're cycling targeting," her tactical officer said, "concentrating on Rampart and Sentinel in rotation. I see it, Rampart, Sentinel, rotate your profiles. Give them a different angle every 30 seconds. She looked at the heat readings from those 2 ships. Elevated but within limit. "How's Rampart's armor?" 81% nominal, Commander. "Holding. Good. Watch it closely." The heat cycling strategy was intelligent, and she gave the Vord credit for it. What they had not accounted for was that the human ships were not designed in isolation. They were designed as a fleet. Each ship's armor could handle more than the Vord were throwing at it continuously. But more importantly, the 7 ships could adjust their positions to share and redistribute incoming fire across the entire line. "All ships close formation by 200 kilometers, she said. Overload your point defense fields, share the load." 7 ships moved, slowly, steadily, coming closer together, their point defense networks linking into a single continuous web across the entire line. The Vord cycling strategy became less effective. Fire that would have concentrated on Rampart's forward sections was now being intercepted, deflected, or absorbed across the shared network. The Vord adapted again. They pushed more ships into the center, building pressure there, trying to force a gap. There was no gap. Voss watched the tactical display and felt, not comfort exactly, but something like recognition. The simulations had looked like this. Not exactly like this. The Vord were smarter and more adaptive than the models had captured, but the shape of it was familiar. The shape of an opponent searching for a weakness in a line that did not have one, trying different approaches in sequence, each one better than the last and each one still insufficient. The primary array cycled again. She fired it into the concentrated center push. The results were as before, absolute. By the 4th hour, the Vord had lost more than 2,000 ships. Drev had stopped counting after the first hour, because the count was so far outside anything in his frame of reference that continuing to count felt like a strange exercise. He watched the tactical display instead, tracking the shapes of the engagement, reading it the way he had been trained to read battles. What he was reading was a battle that the Vord were losing, not losing the way forces lose when they are outmatched on a normal scale, taking damage, falling back, buying time, losing in a specific and unfamiliar way that he had no good military language for. The human line had not moved. Not one of the 7 blue markers had changed position except for the tactical adjustments Voss had made to angles and spacing. They had simply stood there and fired and absorbed fire and fired again, and each time they fired, the Vord fleet became smaller, and the Vord fleet's return fire was making no meaningful difference to the human line's ability to keep firing. The Vord were running out of ships to throw at a line that was not breaking. He thought about the Theris system. 11 minutes. He thought about 14 civilizations, each of them probably watching something that looked like this, a force advancing on them that seemed unstoppable. And the difference between this and those 14 situations was standing in a line across the Cassian Gap, doing the same thing it had been doing for 4 hours without pause. "Commodore," his sensor officer looked up. "The Vord formation, it's changing." He looked at the display. The Vord fleet, which had been pressing forward, always pressing forward. That was what they did, that was what they had always done, was moving backward. He stared at the display. "They're withdrawing," his officer said. Her voice had a quality in it that Drev recognized after a moment as something she had never needed to use in a professional context before. Pure disbelief. "The Vord are withdrawing." "Yes," Drev said. "They've never know," he said. "They haven't." The red mass on the display was moving away from the gap. Not a rout, it was organized, covered by rearguard fire, disciplined even in retreat. Whatever the Vord were, they were not stupid. They were pulling back to preserve what remained of their fleet, to reorganize, to recalculate. But they were going backward. For the first time in the memory of every species in the known galaxy, the Vord were going backward. Voss watched the withdrawal on her display and said nothing for a moment. "Do we pursue?" her tactical officer asked. She considered it. Pursuing would extend their lines, reduce their firing coordination, and reveal things about their mobility that she preferred to keep unknown. The Vord would use that intelligence on their next attempt. They would be back. She had no illusions about that. But they would come back knowing what they knew now, and nothing more. "Hold the gap," she said. "Let them go." She pressed the fleet-wide channel. "All ships, cease primary hold position. Maintain secondary watch on the withdrawal." She paused. "Good work. All of you. Every station, every deck. Good work." She released the channel. The gap was quiet for the first time in 6 hours. She looked at the final damage report across all 7 ships. Armor wear on 3 vessels above 60% of thermal limit, all recovering as the incoming fire stopped. The Aegis had a secondary weapons platform destroyed on her port side. A clean hit that had gone through the point defense net at a bad angle. The Sentinel had a drive thruster offline, not critical to station keeping. The Colossus herself had a section of outer armor, sectors 12 through 40, that was going to need significant repair work. She read the crew casualty list. 3 injuries across the entire fleet. All minor. All from internal system failures during the engagement rather than direct weapons impact. No deaths. She looked at the tactical display. The Vord fleet was still retreating, the red mass moving steadily away from the gap toward the outer rim, shrinking on the display as it receded. They had come in with over 4,000 ships. They were leaving with fewer than 2,000. She accepted the coffee her junior officer brought her. She drank it. She looked at the debris field in the gap, the vast expanding cloud of what had been the Vord's advance force, now scattered across a volume of space large enough to hide small moons in. She thought about 31 years. She thought about all the people who had built this fleet in the cold dark of the outer solar system and never told anyone. All the people who had worked in corridors the size of highway tunnels and replaced power couplings on deck 942, and monitored console readings on deck 712 and kept the secret and kept the faith. She looked at the retreating Vord fleet. "They'll be back," her tactical officer said. He was not wrong to say it. It was the honest assessment. "Yes," Voss said. "And we'll be here." She set down her coffee and picked up the next report. There was still a great deal of work to do. The news traveled faster than any ship. That was the nature of the quantum communication network. It did not care about distance, did not slow for the vast emptiness between systems, did not stop at borders or require anyone's permission. The signal-carrying sensor data from the Cassian Gap went out across the Council network and reached every connected civilization within minutes of the Vord retreat beginning. On 47 worlds and thousands of colonies and stations, people watched the tactical footage. They watched the gap go white with the first broadside. They watched 400 Vord ships simply stop existing. They watched the Vord fleet, the thing that had destroyed the Theris system in 11 minutes, the thing that had consumed 14 civilizations without once slowing, come to a complete stop in open space. They watched it retreat. Most species needed to watch the footage more than once to believe what they were seeing. Some needed to watch it 4 or 5 times. A few kept watching it on repeat for reasons they could not entirely explain. Something in the footage satisfying a need that they didn't have a name for. The need to see, again and again, the moment the tide reversed. The Keth government sent an official message to the Council within 3 hours of the battle's end. The message was 2 sentences long. The first sentence was a formal recognition of humanity's role in the defense of Council space. The second sentence asked if anyone had a way to contact the families of the 4 billion people who died at Theris, because someone needed to tell them that what had happened there had not gone unanswered. Drevik read that second sentence and sat with it for a long time. The Council convened an emergency full session 39 hours after the battle. Every seat was full. The holographic display in the center of the chamber showed the star map, the Vord fleet's retreating position clearly marked at the outer rim, moving away from mapped space, its count updated every few hours by long-range survey drones. The count had stabilized. The Vord had stopped retreating and were holding position at the rim's edge, which meant something. Nobody was certain what it meant yet. Drevik opened the session. "The Vord fleet is holding position at the outer rim boundary," he said. "They are not advancing and they are not dispersing. Theri long-range surveillance is maintaining continuous observation." He looked around the room. "We should proceed on the assumption that they are reorganizing, not withdrawing permanently." Nobody argued with that. The mood in the chamber was not the victorious relief that Drevik had expected. It was something more complicated than that. A mixture of genuine gratitude, real fear about what came next, and something else underneath both of those things. Something that had been building since the first session, when Ambassador Chen had set a data chip on the reader and shown them the updated timeline. Something that had to do with how the galaxy understood itself and its members, and how badly that understanding had been wrong. Ambassador Chen was in her seat in the back row. She had her notepad. She was not writing in it, which was the first time Drevik could remember seeing the notepad closed. The immediate question before this council, Drevik said, is the long-term defense posture. The Vord have retreated, but as we have noted, they are not gone. Commander Voss has maintained the human fleet at the Cassian Gap. They are not withdrawing to home space. He paused. Before we discuss posture, I think the council is owed a more complete conversation with the human delegation. He looked at Chen. Ambassador, the floor is yours. Chen stood. She picked up her notepad and then, after a moment, set it back down and left it on her seat. She walked to the center of the chamber. For a long moment she looked at the star map on the holographic display, the retreating Vord fleet, the 7 blue markers in the gap. She looked at it the way you look at something you have been carrying for a very long time, and have finally set down in a place where other people can see it. Then she looked at the council. I want to say something that is outside the normal diplomatic register, she said. I want to say it plainly, and I want it entered in the record exactly as I say it. Drevik nodded. Go ahead. We are sorry, she said, for the secrecy, for 31 years of building something this significant without telling you. We made the decision we believed we had to make to protect the program and protect the outcome. We stand by the decision. But we understand what it cost in terms of trust, and we do not take that lightly. She paused. We should have found a way to warn you about the timeline acceleration 2 years ago. We chose operational security over notification, and 4 billion people at Theros died in that gap. We have thought about this a great deal in the past 40 hours. We will continue to think about it. The chamber was very quiet. Councillor Meth spoke from the 3rd tier. His voice was careful, the voice of someone who had prepared what he wanted to say and was checking himself against it as he spoke. You said we, you mean Earth's government, or the program's command structure? Both, Chen said. The decision-making was distributed. Multiple governments, multiple command levels, all reaching the same conclusions. This was not the choice of one leader or one body. She looked at him steadily. This was what humanity decided, collectively. Why, Piva of the Morali said, not harshly, genuinely. Why did humanity make this choice? You were 300 years into space travel. You had 12 warships. You could have come to this council with your intelligence data, with your analysis, and asked for help. You could have advocated for a coalition response. Instead, you chose to do it alone. She paused. Why? Chen was quiet for a moment. Then she said, because when we looked at the data, we saw what the Vord were. We saw that they had never stopped. We saw that 14 civilizations had preceded us, and none of them had stopped the Vord either. And we asked ourselves, what would we need specifically to stop something that has never been stopped? She looked around the chamber. The answer was not a coalition. The answer was something specific and enormous and hidden, deployed at a place and time of our choosing, against a threat that did not yet know it existed. She paused again. A coalition takes time to build. Coalitions leak. Coalitions negotiate capability downward to accommodate the smallest partner's limitations. We needed something that was not any of those things. So we built it ourselves. A long silence followed. Drevik broke it. And now, he said, what does humanity want now? You hold a military capability that exceeds anything else in known space. The balance of power in this galaxy changed 39 hours ago. You know that, we know that. What do you intend to do with it? Chen looked at him for a moment. Go home, she said. The chamber stirred. Eventually, she said. The fleet will hold the gap until we are confident the Vord are not returning imminently. Then we will withdraw to a position from which we can deploy quickly if needed. We are not interested in occupying the gap permanently. We are not interested in using our military capability to dictate terms to this council or any member species. She paused. We want the things we asked for in our last session. A permanent seat on the security subcommittee, full database access, recognition of our territorial claims. She looked around the room. And we want a better early warning system, one that the entire council operates together, with full data sharing, so that if the Vord change direction and accelerate again, everyone knows at the same time. You want a coalition now, Meth said. There was something dry in his voice, not quite accusatory. We want a coalition now, Chen said, because now there is something to build a coalition around. The Vord know we are here. They will come back with a different approach. When they do, a coordinated council response with the human fleet as the anchor is better than the human fleet alone. She tilted her head slightly. We were always going to need help eventually. We simply needed to establish the foundation first. Drevik looked at her. He had spent 6 years finding her charming and slightly amusing. He thought now that he had never actually been looking at her. He had been looking at a performance she was giving for his benefit, and he had watched it without ever wondering what was behind it. One more question, Ambassador, he said. And I ask it genuinely, not as an accusation. Did you know when you joined this council 6 years ago that your fleet was already being built? Yes, Chen said. And every session you attended, every note you took, every trade dispute you sat through that had nothing to do with humanity. I was learning, she said simply. Every system has a logic to it. I wanted to understand the logic of this one, how decisions were made, where the power actually sat versus where it appeared to sit, what each species feared and what it valued. She paused. We were going to need to work with you all eventually. I wanted to understand you first. Drevik sat with that for a long time. Then he said, you are a very patient people. Chen picked up her notepad from her seat. She opened it. She clicked her pen. We had to be, she said. Commodore Drev submitted his battle assessment report to Thari High Command 4 days after the engagement. The report was thorough. It covered the engagement timeline, the human fleet's tactical decisions, the Vord's adaptive responses, the final outcome. It covered the weapons performance data, the armor ratings observed under actual combat conditions, the movement capabilities of ships that size under combat maneuvering. He spent a long time on the final section, the section that was technically labeled strategic assessment, but which was really about something harder to put in military language. He wrote, prior to this engagement, the Theri Confederacy, and the Council more broadly, operated under the assumption that humanity was a young developing species of limited strategic significance. This assessment was incorrect in every meaningful dimension. He paused. He thought about how to say the next part accurately. He wrote, humanity did not develop slowly and then surprise us. They developed in a specific direction, for a specific purpose, while deliberately allowing us to underestimate them. The 12 warships we cataloged were real. They also represented, in retrospect, an intentional misdirection, not by active deception but by the simple choice to build what mattered where no one was looking. He stopped again. He looked at what he had written. He wrote, I do not know how to categorize a species that responds to an extinction-level threat by going quiet for 31 years and building something adequate to address it. I do not know how to categorize a species whose ambassador takes detailed notes at every council session for 6 years, while her government builds 7 planet-sized warships in a region of space we were not watching. He stopped a third time. He wrote finally, I recommend we begin watching humans more carefully, not with suspicion, with respect. There is a difference, and I think it matters very much which of those two things we choose. He sent the report. On the Colossus, Kale Marsh replaced the last of the damaged power couplings in Sector 12. There were a lot of them. The armor heating in the outer sectors during the battle had stressed the coupling infrastructure throughout the hull, and the repair list his supervisor had given him was long enough that he had stopped looking at the end of it and focused instead on working through it, item by item. This was the 47th coupling he had replaced since the battle ended. He was keeping count. He finished, sealed the panel, ran the diagnostic. Green. He gathered his tools and floated toward the viewport above the access panel. He looked out. The Cassian Gap was quiet now. The debris from the battle was still spreading slowly outward. It would continue spreading for years before it dispersed completely. And in the light from the nearest stars it caught and reflected in thin bright threads, a faint permanent reminder of what had happened here, scattered across a volume of space large enough to lose planets in. Further out, the stars were the same stars they had always been, cold and bright and entirely indifferent to the events of the last several days. He thought about his sister's kids. He thought about his mother, who had called twice since the battle, and not been able to reach him, because the fleet was still on limited communications. He thought about what he was going to say when he finally got through to her. He had told her he worked on relay stations. He was going to have to explain, now, why relay stations had been in the news as the thing that won the largest military engagement in galactic history. He did not yet know exactly how to explain that. He thought about Priya, one deck below him, working through her own repair list, wearing a very good watch that her father had bought her to commemorate her achievement in deep space communications infrastructure. He looked at the debris field and then past it, at the dark rim of the galaxy where the Vord fleet was sitting, somewhere beyond sensor range, reorganizing and recalculating. They would come back. Voss had said so, and Voss did not say things she didn't mean. They would come back differently, with whatever adaptation they had developed in the quiet of the rim, and the fleet would be here to meet them. 7 ships in the gap, maybe more, if Earth Command moved ahead with the second construction phase that had been in planning for the last 2 years. More ships, bigger, better, because that was what you did. You looked at what the threat was, and you did the math, and you built what the math required, and you held the line. That was all it was, really. All the complexity, and the 31 years, and the secrecy, and the 11,000 people per ship, and the power couplings, and the monitoring consoles, and the very good coffee on deck 400, all of it reduced, in the end, to the simple decision to hold the line. He thought about the 14 civilizations that hadn't. He pressed his hand flat against the hull. The metal was cool now, all the battle heat long since dissipated into the cold of space. It was just a hull again, heavy and solid and real under his palm. 9,000 kilometers of it. He stayed there for a moment, hand on the hull, looking at the stars. His comm clicked. Marsh. How many more on that list, he checked. 41. A pause. There's a fresh pod on level 400 if you need a break. He thought about it. I'll finish the sector first, he said. Your call. The comm clicked off. He picked up his tools. He pushed off the wall and floated toward the next access panel, 41 panels away, in a corridor the size of a highway tunnel, on a ship the size of a small moon, in a gap between the galaxy and something that had wanted to consume it. The stars outside the viewport were quiet. The Colossus breathed around him. He went back to work.